You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming to you now, live, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. As always, the opinions expressed on Long Waves are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. And thank you for joining me today. We've got a little touch of autumn in the air, I do believe. Anyway, it is the crazy season, at least in politics, and every time I go to the news, there is Trump and there is Hillary and there is a lot of, what shall we call it, dog and pony show? With very few people addressing real issues, very few people getting their nails dirty in the fight. Although Dr. Jill Stein, the presidential candidate for the Green Party, I note, may be facing charges of trespass and vandalism for spray painting the front blade of a bulldozer at the Dakota blockade to stop the pipeline. But I keep reading the news, and occasionally I even read some of the pundits who write about the news, although there aren't that many of them I find interesting anymore. And it occurs to me that one of our big problems, one of our great problems as a nation is how we have changed our understanding of politics, how politics itself has morphed underneath us. So I want to explore that a bit today. And if I don't finish it today, we'll continue on next week. But we could just start with framing the issue here a little bit. It seems to me we have largely two working definitions of politics in this country. And one is the classic liberal ideal of politics as a site of struggle and contest for power and control, where people get out there and they're rational actors and they're all arguing for what they think should happen. And we sort of leave it at that. We never dive much beyond that. Well, we're going to dive somewhat beyond that this afternoon, particularly with some writings of Richard Rorty and Chantal Mouffe and, Henry Giroux and just all sorts of interesting people. Well, let's think. So we've got on the one hand, we've got this site of struggle and contest where rational actors get together and discuss what is the best outcome. And we argue, and the idea is we're somehow going to persuade one another. Okay, that's the classical model, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And there's the second model, which is politics as the management of people, politics as the management of power. Now, this does imply that there's been a break between power and politics, that they have, in fact, merged into one thing. Now, the first definition that we work with a lot is admittedly flawed, and it's unrealistic, and it's idealistic, and it's really poorly thought out and discussed, at least in the popular frame. We just all take it for granted, that it's one of those things that is just inherently true, and we're just supposed to accept it. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the second point is true, that politics is become pragmatic in the extreme, and that perhaps politics is really no longer involved in power, not the kind of politics we've traditionally seen. Certainly there's bureaucratic infighting, and there are factions in the military-industrial complex and factions in the State Department who push and scramble to get their views acted upon. But in the long run, this has very little to do with you or I and our sense of what we would like to have addressed. So if the neocons in the White House and some of the neolibs like Kagan and Victoria Nuland, who we've talked about before, if some of these people see themselves as driving policy, really that's a break from representing us to creating policy themselves. So what's going on with the Clinton and Trump stuff and, the whole political debate generally? These people say so much, and they make all these promises. Wait, politicians make promises? Even more, politicians make promises that they have no intention of keeping and know they can't keep. And they say much, but it will do little for you and I, I'm afraid. So anyway, we have really, as I say, two ideas of what politics can be. And there are those who say that the idea of the classic democratic liberal political system is broken and corrupted beyond repair. Chris Hedges, among others, keeps returning to this point again and again and again. And there is some truth that you can't have radical change. You can't have a revolution in a counter-revolutionary organization like the DNC or the RNC. So, there is some truth for that. But let's just tease this out a little bit and think about where did these classic liberal ideas come from, and how did they emerge, and how did they change? So if we go back to classic liberalism, big L, and I have to remind myself, as well as my listeners, that the United States is the only country in the world where liberal means progressive, or used to mean progressive. Everywhere else in the world, it means conservative or Tory. And this has to do with the roots of classical liberalism in people like Thomas Hobbes and people like Paine and people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others who were very involved in trying to sort out how does society work and how should it work. So if we go back, to the classic ideas of liberalism, the liberalism of Hobbes, for example, or Thomas Paine, it presupposes a great number of things about people. It makes a lot of assumptions about what people are. And part of this stems from philosophers always wanting to see the world through their own lens. Part of it has to do with Thomas Hobbes having just lived through the English Civil War, a remarkably bloody and vicious conflict, which seriously changed his ideas about people. Okay, so according to them, we all lived in this state of nature once upon a time when there were no governments and there was no politics, and we all lived in this libertarian paradise of absolute solitary responsibility for ourselves. So in this, what did we do? We pursued our own interests, because not to pursue our own interests would not be rational, right? And we're rational creatures. So immediately we've got rational. There's an assumption that human beings are rational and act rationally in the pursuit of their own self-interest. And then we have this notion of self-interest. What is one's self-interest? And this is a real problem with the whole liberal notion. What is self-interest? And does my self-interest, what if my self-interest conflicts with your self-interest? Then what? Well, then we have a conflict, don't we? So they also thought that human beings, Hobbes in particular, assumed that human beings were hedonistic. They were in the pursuit of their own pleasure. They would seek to maximize their pleasure and minimize their pain. Okay, maybe. There are a lot of counter-arguments to that one, though. And, of course, that people were just kind of, inherently lazy and wouldn't get involved in much unless it was in their self-interest to do so. Okay, so this is classic liberalism. And according to Hobbes, before there was a state, we lived in this state of nature, which was nasty, where life was nasty and short and brutish, and it was, jungle law, fang and claw, and we're all fighting each other, and which is a pretty apt description of what went on in the English Civil War. So you can see where Hobbes got his ideas to some extent. Like all civil wars, it was exquisitely vicious. So I had a lot of people, out there fighting each other, tooth and nail. And Hobbes' solution was Leviathan. You need some organizer, some great power, preferably a king for Hobbes. But, we have presidents and football stars or whatever. We have our own versions of the Leviathan. And so we join in a social contract to protect ourselves from the predations of others. And in so doing, the social contract, the Leviathan, the king, the president, the government, whatever, is supposed to protect us from other people, to ensure our rights, but it also comes with a limitation of rights. So I give up my right to rape, plunder, pillage, commit arson, whatever, in exchange for the state ostensibly protecting me from these things, okay? So that's the classic liberal model. And so what would democratic politics be with that? It would be arguing for your rational self-interest, trying to convince other reasonable people of your position, and trying to create political systems that would serve your self-interest. Okay, fair enough. Now, there's another political movement we need to throw into this, and that's conservatism. And conservatism really is classic liberalism, this idea of laissez-faire, the idea of not in of just letting corporations and companies and markets and people, just leave them alone, let them pursue their own rational self-interest, and the miracle of the marketplace will balance everything out. Interesting idea, unsupported by evidence, but it's an interesting idea. So in this conservatism, there's also a strong individualist streak. But it's a strong individualist streak that uses very specific historical and cultural frames. It occurs within these historical and cultural frames to preserve the old. Well, what is the old? What is your culture? Is your culture fundamentalist Christian? Is your culture Catholic? Is your culture African? What is it? And conservatism, of course, would try to preserve what is needed of that to hold society together. These are the kind of classic approaches. And we still think, that politics is about politicians talking to us like we're rational beings and we're going to respond. And somehow we're always surprised. We're always so surprised when a Donald Trump comes out of the woodwork and says all kinds of outlandish things that go right to the viscera, right to the guts of a lot of people. And it's not a rational idea. It's an emotional idea. It's a feeling. I'm going to bomb everybody. We're going to stop all these people who are threatening. We're going to make America great again. We're going to expand our military because that makes us safer in some people's heads, though it actually makes our lives more precarious, which I've talked about before. Anyway. If we think about what's going on, it really has not a lot to do with making rational arguments, because Hillary will make her promises and will break almost all of them. And whatever Trump promises, he will break almost all of them. And again, very little will actually play out for us. So in any rational argument, we would be well aware of this. Yes? We'd be going, this is crazy talk. I don't believe either of these people, but I must vote for this one to stop the greater evil. Oh, dear. Well, I and some of the people I want to bring to you today, at least in their writings, want to break down some of this false thinking. Chantal Mouffe, in a fascinating essay called Culture, Identity, and Democracy, makes the point that, quote, liberal democracy is not the application of the democratic model to a wider context. Understood as a regime, it concerns the symbolic ordering of social relations and is much more than a form of government. Now, that's an interesting statement. It's not the application of a liberal democracy, is not the application of a democratic model to a big social context. It structures society. It's a symbolic ordering. Now, what does she mean by a symbolic ordering, what she calls a regime? It tells us what our relationships to each other are, what our relationships to government are. It teaches us these, whether it's that ridiculous and semi-fascistic knee-jerk thing that Americans do of pledging allegiance to the flag, which is change the name of the flag and a few of the words, and it would have worked fine in Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany or Franco's Spain or Mussolini's Italy. This knee-jerk pledging of allegiance, these oaths. But that's another structuring, isn't it? That's another symbolic ordering of our social relationship to the state. And our social relationship to each other is what? What do I owe my neighbors? What do my neighbors owe me? My neighbor's cat gets into my yard. My dogs bite it. What is my relationship to my neighbor? A symbolic ordering. And that ordering can say, I owe my neighbor nothing. Or that ordering can say, I should think charitably of my neighbor and reach out to help. But if we take this classic liberal model of democracy, my interest is going to be my own self-interest, as I view it rationally, my own self-interest. And accordingly, my relationships to people around me are, if they can't help me, they are of no use to me. They're of no use to me. And increasingly, this is the structure of politics that we have in this country. Here's the bit, again quoting Chantal Mouffe. We should conceptualize power not as an external relation taking place between two pre-constituted identities, but rather as constituting the identities themselves. In other words, we don't pre-exist and then suddenly get all rational and negotiate power relations with people. Power relations shape us. They shape us as men and women. They shape us as straight and gay and trans. They constitute our identity in a lot of ways. And one could refer to this as hegemony, kind of a textbook definition. But yeah. So we end up structured by the very politics that we think, we have been told, are the tool that is supposed to set us free, and the tool that is supposed to empower us. So that kind of brings me back to the second model, that perhaps power is no longer involved in politics per se, but is simply the naked use of power to construct symbolic orderings of society for us. If you're white, you're this. If you're black, you're that. If you're poor, you're this. If you're rich, you're that. And to a large extent, we see this play out. Well, there's so many ways I could approach this issue, but let me just take this one, because this was very recent, from one of my favorite analysts, Moon of Alabama. And he's discussing this, this recent use of chlorine gas in Aleppo by the Syrian government, without a shred of documentation or truth, mind you. Not a shred of documentation, just the blank assertion that Assad used barrel bombs to drop chlorine on his own city. Okay. Well, let's back up a little bit. Back in April 28th, to be exact, the Washington Post had the headline, "Airstrike Destroys Syrian Hospital Among Fears of Catastrophic Turn in Fighting." Okay. And it goes on to say, an onslaught of airstrikes in rebel-held areas of the Syrian city of Aleppo has killed scores and destroyed a hospital supported by international aid groups, activists, and humanitarian workers, blah, blah, blah. And then airstrikes Wednesday night collapsed a hospital. And then it was the hospital raid late Wednesday that was likely to have the most devastating humanitarian impact. And then the Al-Quds Hospital in Aleppo neighborhood had an emergency room, an intensive care unit, 8 doctors and 28 nurses on staff. Doctors Without Borders said. It was well known locally, the organization said on its Twitter account. And at least 14 patients and medical staffers, including 3 doctors, were killed when the hospital was hit by a direct strike. Okay, so hold that in your head. And then just yesterday, we get the Washington Post, September 8, 2016. Chlorine attack deepens fears among besieged Aleppo residents. The Syrian government dropped a bomb containing chlorine on a besieged neighborhood in the city of Aleppo, heightening fears among people who are cut off from the outside world and unable to escape. A statement from the Al-Quds Hospital, which received 46 of the patients, said all were suffering from breathing difficulties and a strong smell of chlorine. So just get the bit. So the hospital had collapsed in April. It's been besieged ever since. Doctors were killed. So this is the destroyed and collapsed hospital, which, if we're to believe this story, was somehow magically rebuilt during this siege and intense fighting. And it had room for 46 patients, and it's very well equipped. There's a picture in the Washington Post article that shows a young child in the Al-Quds Hospital with a breathing mask. And as Moon of Alabama point out, next to him are 5 electronic infusion pumps. More expensive medical electronic equipment is visible in the background. This supposedly in an area that is besieged, has no electricity, is under constant bombing, and with no access to the outer world. Okay. This story reeks of a concoction. This story reeks of an attempt to demonize Syria and Assad as monsters, justifying whatever response the U.S. takes against them. But notice there is no way these two stories can be true. Either the first story is false or the second story is false. Or they're both false. Moon of Alabama continues, isn't it astonishing that the Syrian government always launches these chlorine attacks just after the rebels suffered a military defeat? Or are these attacks, claimed only by the rebels, a propaganda diversion from their military defeats? He continues, note also this oddity. Months after Aleppo's last pediatrician was killed, as claimed in the first piece, 6 killed pediatricians from East Aleppo. All right, so we had the last pediatrician in Aleppo who was killed. And then we have, shortly after, 6 pediatricians from Aleppo signing an open letter to President Obama. Oh, dear. You see how there's a problem with the facts, but it's a paper that serves its purpose. And these reports are apparently from these white helmet groups. Well, white helmets get $60 million from the U.S. and the U.K. and other governments, and they create propaganda against the Assad government, and actually propaganda showing the militants, often including affiliates of Al-Qaeda, as the good guys. The good guys, because they're killing for us. We're killing. They're killing for us. So what's all this got to do with politics? Well, this is a way of actually short-circuiting. These kinds of stories are a way of actually short-circuiting any kind of meaningful politics. Instead of us being rational creatures who have access to good information, we are lied to. And we're lied into very particular kinds of identities. We are symbolically ordered into very particular kinds of identities. And this is not a one-off. This bit with Aleppo, this has been going on for decades, for years. In many senses, it's been going on from the beginning of this country. And I pointed out Jefferson's skepticism about the news. Let me give you another example here of how important some people in government find it to be to make sure that you and I hear the things we're supposed to hear. And I'm going to be citing a CIA document. It's document number 1035-960. And it was released under an FOIA, a FOIA Freedom of Information Act request, some years ago. But it's kind of interesting just to stroll through it. The document was initiated because the CIA was concerned about the conspiracy theories surrounding JFK's death. And they needed to counter that. Well, first of all, why? Why is it the CIA's job to counter that? And why is the CIA even involved in U.S. politics and U.S. news when by law they're supposed to be forbidden from these things? Oh, well. These irksome little facts get in the way, don't they? So, let me just share with you some of their ideas. So, they're concerned that critics have speculated as to the existence of some kind of conspiracy, and then implied that the Warren Commission was involved. Presumably, I'm quoting exactly, presumably as a result of the increasing challenge to the Warren Commission's report, a public opinion poll recently indicated that 46% of the American public did not think Oswald acted alone, while more than half of those polled thought that the commission had left some questions unresolved. Doubtless, polls abroad would show similar or possibly more adverse results. Okay, so here are people who have some justifiable concerns with the Warren Commission, just like they have justifiable concerns with the 9/11 Commission and with the findings in general. But instead of discussing these, instead of treating people as rational actors, well, you can't leave the structuring of what you want society to be to people making up their own minds. That would be crazy talk. So, quoting from the document again, Western European critics see Kennedy's assassination as part of a subtle conspiracy attributable to, perhaps even in rumors I have heard, Kennedy's successor, Johnson. Right. Okay. And they're concerned about this trend of opinion. They say this trend of opinion is a matter of concern to the U.S. government, including our organization. And goes on to say what a great group the Warren Commission were and what a great job they did. Quote, our organization itself is directly involved. Among other facts, we contributed information to the investigation. Conspiracy theories have frequently thrown suspicion on our organization. For example, by falsely alleging that Lee Harvey Oswald worked for us. Shocking. And then they had a series of things that were to take care of the information management in the U.S. So, action. We do not recommend that discussion of the assassination question be initiated where it is not already taking place. Where discussion is active, business addresses are requested. To discuss the publicity problem with friendly elite contacts, especially politicians and editors, that would be newspaper editors, pointing out that it was such a great job the Warren Commission did. Let's see. The charges of the critics are without serious foundation, that further speculative discussion only plays into the hands of the opposition, whoever that is. Point out also that parts of conspiracy talk appear to be deliberately generated by communist propagandists. Oh, heavens. Urge them to use their influence to discourage unfounded and irresponsible speculation. Employ propaganda assets to negate and refute the attacks of critics. Book reviews and feature articles are particularly appropriate. In private to-media discussions not directed at any particular writer or in attacking publications that may yet be forthcoming, the following arguments should be used. No new evidence has emerged which the Commission did not consider. Critics usually overvalue particular items and ignore others. Conspiracy on a large scale often suggested would be impossible to conceal in the United States. A conspirator, moreover, would hardly choose a location for a shooting where so much depended on conditions beyond his control, the route, the speed of the cars, the moving target, the risk that the assassin would be discovered. Well, that's a really remarkable statement. A conspirator would hardly choose a location for a shooting where so much depended. An assassin would hardly choose a location for a shooting where so much depended on conditions beyond his control. And, as is kind of a standard operating procedure, you bury lies and lies and lies, so that if one lie unpeels, the next lie is asserted and upheld. And the assumption here, of course, is that Oswald acted alone and was just a crazy person. In fact, they go on to say, Oswald would not have been any sensible person's choice for a co-conspirator. He was a loner mixed up of questionable reliability and an unknown quantity to any professional intelligence service. Well, we won't even get into that. But you see how they keep the story structured. Critics have often been enticed by a form of intellectual pride. They light on some theory and fall in love with it. So the critics themselves are irrational. That's the tack they're supposed to take. And where possible, counter speculation by encouraging reference to the committee's report itself. Open-minded readers. So if you don't, let me just read this. Open-minded readers should be impressed by the care, thoroughness, objectivity, and speed with which the commission worked. Open-minded foreign readers should be impressed by the thoroughness, objectivity, and speed. Well, the same should hold true for the 9/11 report then. You can just reference how thorough and careful and objective and speedy the commission was. Or the MH17 investigation, or just any number of things we could mention here, or the bombing of a hospital in Aleppo. So obviously, we don't live in a world where these institutions of enormous power actually speak to us, where they actually take us seriously. So, you can think about this for a minute. Let's go back to Chantal Mouffe. And she's taking issue with John Rawls, another theorist of government. And she says, for Rawls, a well-ordered society is a society from which politics has been eliminated. A conception of justice is mutually recognized by reasonable and rational citizens who act in accordance to its injunctions. They probably have very different and even conflicting conceptions of the good, but those are strictly private matters and do not interfere with their public life. Conflicts of interests about economic and social issues, if they still arise, are resolved smoothly through discussions within the framework of public reason by invoking the principles of justice that everybody endorses. If an unreasonable or a rational person happens to disagree with the state of affairs and intends to disrupt that nice consensus, she must be forced through coercion to submit to the principles of justice. Well, that is kind of the classic liberal idea of utopia, right? As she says, it would be a society in which legitimate dissent would have been eliminated from the public sphere. And don't all authoritarian regimes do this? You eliminate dissent. You eliminate actual freedom and replace it with staged freedom, which usually involves some statement of allegiance to the powers that be. Look at the kerfluffle over a football player not standing up for the Pledge of Allegiance. Would have fit right into Stalinist Russia, Stalinist Soviet. Well, the point, the critique that Dr. Mouffe makes about this approach is that it presupposes that political actors are driven only by what they see as their rational self-advantage. Quote, passions are erased from the realm of politics, which is reduced to a neutral field of competing interests. Completely missing from such an approach is the political in its dimension of power, antagonism, and relationships of forces. What political liberalism is at pains to eliminate is the element of undecidability that is present in human relations. It offers us a picture of a well-ordered society as one from which, through rational agreement on justice, antagonism, violence, power, and repression have disappeared. But it's only because they have been made invisible through a clever stratagem. The distinction between simple and reasonable pluralism. Simple and reasonable pluralism. So if somebody says something out of the ordinary or something threatening or something you haven't heard before, you can simply dismiss it as outside of the realm of reasonable discussion. And if you've already categorized entire fields of discussion, such as independent thought, analysis, dissent with official government statements and findings, well, then you can also simply be excluded. And thus, the frontiers between what is legitimate and what is not legitimate show up, and we can see these as power. But it doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like it. How do you eliminate, as she writes, how do you eliminate adversaries while remaining neutral? It's hard to do. So what are we supposed to do about all that? Well, one thing we could do is give up the idea that there is anything like a rational political consensus, which is not based on some kind of exclusion. Because we're letting some ideas in, we're letting some ideas out. And increasingly, the ideas that are acceptable and the ideas that are unacceptable are not of our making. They're being constructed for us. They're being constructed for us. What is acceptable language? What may you say? What may you not say? I mean, here back in 2014, Newsweek magazine had a cover story that was entitled, "The Plots to Destroy America. Conspiracy Theories Are a Clear and Present Danger." Well, I think a much clearer and more present danger is this corporate media operating often as stenographers for the CIA, for various forces in the government, and passing this off as news. You know, it's hard to come up with a rationalist defense of liberal democracy. It really is. As Mouffe writes, it's beyond. Well, how does she put it here? She says, in searching for an argument that is beyond argumentation and in wanting to define the meaning of the universal, that universal truth we all believe in, it makes the same mistake for which it criticizes totalitarianism, the rejection of democratic indeterminacy, and identification of the universal with a given particular. Because this modern democratic politics, it has this notion of some kind of universal thing, like it's universally bad to kill civilians. It's universally bad to start wars. And yet those universals are observed by our government anyway, more often in the breach than they are in the recognition. And this is a problem for us because it undermines the very idea of what should constitute our society, of what should constitute our state, of what should constitute our existence, our being. As Henry Giraud noted in his book, The Violence of Organized Forgetting, quote, unlike some theorists who suggest that politics as a site of contestation, critical exchange, and engagement has either come to an end or is in a state of terminal deterrence, I believe that the current state of subprime politics points to the urgent challenge of reformulating the crisis of America and the radical imagination as part of a fundamental crisis of vision, meaning, education, and political agency. Politics devoid of vision degenerates into either cynicism or appropriates a view of power equated with domination. And that's where we are. We see politics either as cynicism or we recognize it as equated with domination. And this goes right to the heart of our problem. And it is complicated by our immersion in a near perfect pond of media, so that even the things in media that we don't see or read still fill this background, still fill the background of the frame that we're in. As Stanley Aronowitz wrote, the social character has become entwined with communications technology. This intricate interlock between cultural institutions, political power, and everyday life constitutes a new moment of history. It's become the primary machinery of domination. An essential aspect of domination is the abrogation of concept that we can know the totality, but are condemned to understand the division of world as a series of specializations. And this fragmentation of the social world that he's about. That only specialists can know this. And, that opens the door, or closes the door, to gaining a lot of understanding of what the specialists are about, or who they are, or what their aims are. So I am going to have to continue this next week. So we'll call this part one of, what shall we call this series? How about, well, there's politics and politics. I can probably come up with something better, but if you got a better idea, you can always write me. But just to recap, we have these two traditions. This idea of political liberalism derived from Hobbes, the rule of law, the separation of powers, individual rights, the right of the right of the sovereign, and a democratic tradition of popular sovereignty. So much of this, too, we are still haunted by these old ideas. Richard Rorty, and I'll talk more about him next week, writes, human nature, rationality, and morality are abbreviations for kinds of human conduct we wish to encourage. In other words, if we like something, we say it's rational or it's moral. And thus we assume it's acceptable and not one of those things we need to cut out of the public sphere, out of political discussion. He continues, to say that a certain course of conduct is more in accord with human nature or our moral sense or more rational than another is just a fancy way of commending one's own sense of what is most worth preserving in our present practices, of commending our own utopian vision of our community. Our own utopian vision. Based on what? Politics, an understanding of theories of government, an understanding of what we're supposed to be about, or a remarkably dumbed down, simplified dog and pony show, which is trotted out for us every 2 years and 4 years, in which the same dogs and the same ponies with different costumes appear again and again and again, and nothing changes. So we'll dive back into this next week. My goodness, how the hour has flown. I'd like to thank you so much for listening. You've been listening to Long Waves Radio. I'm your host, Gary Krug, and if you have comments you want to write, you can write me at longwaves, 2 words, longwaves at kyrs.org. Find me on Facebook, Long Waves Radio, and I'll be happy to hear your comments, read your comments. One thing I do have to do before I go is to remind you that, well, we've got our big fundraising drive coming up here in a couple of weeks. So more about that to come. But also, another way you can help us is if you've got a car, truck, or boat lying around that you want to get rid of. It's easy. We'll put it to good use, and you'll get a tax receipt you can deduct from your taxes next year. It is so easy to do. You pick up your phone. You call 855-KYRS-CAR. 855-KYRS, CAR. We'll arrange a free pickup. It is no muss, no fuss. You give them the title. They take your vehicle or boat. And you get a deduction off your taxes. We get a few pennies to help keep the lights on down here. So it's really easy. 855-KYRS, CAR. I'll be back next week with installment 2 of, well, there's politics and there's politics. Again, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Until next week, think outside the box. Don't think what's suggested. Be a little radical. Step out of the particular space, the particular identity that's been created for you. It can be kind of fun. Thanks again. Till next week. And you've been listening to KYRS Medical Lake and Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 FM. Bye-bye.